Fighting any adverse condition only increases its power over you. And this is about balancing your desire to live in a peaceful world with messages of evil continually bombarding you. Two quotes, one from Confucius. Quote, "To see and listen to the wicked is already the beginning of wickedness," unquote. And from the Holy Quran, quote, "Whatever good you have is all from God. Whatever evil, all is from yourself," unquote. On a daily basis, we hear from a variety of sources that our world is turned upside down, evil exists everywhere, and terrorism is a way of life. People seem determined to kill each other in increasingly violent ways, while young children are recruited to become suicide bombers in the name of God. Radio, television, and online news outlets dispense an endless cascade of man's inhumanity to man. Family members gone berserk, teenagers on killing rampages in their schools, and terror cells rocking Earth's consciousness everywhere, from train stations to places of worship. I could go on and on describing the ways in which we're continually bombarded by the media, but I'm going to stop because I'd be violating the central premise of this chapter. The point I'm making here is that we seem to live in a totally out-of-balance world where our desires for feeling peaceful are challenged by the myriad non-peaceful energies that are considered newsworthy. But we do have a choice in this matter, and we can choose to realign ourselves energetically with our desire to live in this world peacefully, regardless of what's going on around us, and in spite of the non-peaceful energy we're so often subjected to. We can begin by deciding to maintain a tranquil existence within ourselves, even when others promote fear, anger, and hatred about this violent planet. After all, a massive collective effort throughout the history of humanity by those in positions of authority has taught individuals whom to fear and, even worse, whom to hate. If we'd been alive in America back in the 1750s, we'd have been told that it was our patriotic duty to hate the French as well as the Native Americans. 25 years later, we'd have been told that it was okay to stop hating the French, but that we were obliged to hate the British. Now fast forward 87 years, and if we lived in the South, we'd be told to hate those in the North. And Northerners alike were required to hate Southerners, even if they were related by blood. And by the way, it was no longer a requirement that we hate the British. Now move ahead 34 years, and it wasn't necessary to hate the Spanish, but once again it's acceptable to love those who lived in a different latitude in your own country. 20 years later, it was fine to love the Spanish, but compulsory to hate the Germans, and in just a few decades, the Japanese would be added to our required hate list. Then it became all right to stop hating the Germans and Japanese, but we had to hate communists, be they in North Korea or North Vietnam, several years later. In other words, there's always been a collection of people being added to or deleted from the hate inventory. For a long time, we were required to hate Russians, then Iranians. We could love the Iraqis, but only for a short time. Then we reversed those on the hate list. We were obliged to hate the formerly loved Iraqis, and it was okay to love the Iranians that only 10 years before we were told to hate. Then came the Taliban and even more obscure categories such as terrorists, whom we used to be required to love, and insurgents, whoever they are now, became mandatory targets of our hate. On and on goes this litany of hate. The faces change, but the message remains. We're told whom to hate, never for a moment recognizing that the enemy we're supposed to hate isn't a nationality. The enemy is hatred itself. Removing yourself from all hate lists. Arthur Egendorf, writing in Healings from the War, offers this advice that's pertinent to our efforts to rebalance our life and to live peacefully. Only together will we create a culture that supersedes the cycles of battle and retreat, not through our fear of war, but through mastering a superior way to live. The seed of this culture is the determination with individuals and then small groups and communities to devote our lives to the greatest vision of all time, not to wait for a savior one day to deliver us, not to wait for a government to pass truly just laws, not to wait for a revolution to right the wrongs of a cruel world, and not to mount a crusade to overpower some distant source of evil beyond ourselves. Each of us, singly, and with all the others, is answerable for creating joy through the way our lives unfold here and now. And once this purpose becomes primary, we can turn to the endless job of bringing well-being to others, justice and integrity to our government, and instituting constructive programs for change here and elsewhere. When inspired in this way, we don't have to wait for the final outcome before we're nourished. There is no finer way to live or die. The words that speak loudest to me in this sagacious observation are, each of us, singly and with all the others, is answerable for creating joy through the way our lives unfold here and now, unquote. I suggest that the number one thing you can do singly to create joy is remove hate from your inner consciousness. This may be surprising, but please let it sink in. Those who hate war are just as responsible for the presence of war as those who hate their assigned enemies and fight to kill them. Those who hate crime are part of the crime problem. Those who hate cancer make cancer a foe and become part of the cancer problem. Like everything else in this program, the secret to rebalancing life is not necessarily to change your behavior as much as it is to realign yourself and create a culture that supersedes the cycles of battle and retreat. Whenever we use force to resolve our disputes, we instantly create a counterforce. This is largely responsible for the never-ending cycles of war that have defined human history. Force, counterforce, more force, and the battles go on, generation after generation. This is true within you as well. A thought of hate creates a thought of revenge, and then more hateful thoughts in response. And the real problem is that these thoughts of hatred and revenge begin to define your existence. They become your point of attraction. Your initial desire to live peacefully in a world that the media reports has gone berserk is a spiritually balanced desire. In order to materialize your desire, you must extend thoughts that match the energy of that desire. Thoughts of hate will not blossom into your desired peacefulness, and the reason has been repeated throughout this program. You attract more and more of that which you desire to eradicate. Breaking the cycle. You can detach yourself from thoughts of hatred, despite the news from a media driven by a profit mentality. The more you buy into hatred, the more those who sell the messages benefit. But you can decide that you'll be an instrument of joy. So how does an instrument of joy react to a cacophony of loud, disturbing news? If you're in balance, you're most likely able to assess the place of love and peace that you are. You remember your mission and your desire to be in balance and peaceful by asserting that even though millions of others elect to be in hatred, this is simply not your calling. You didn't decide to incarnate into a world where everyone has the same vision. Your thoughts turn to, I'm a divine creation. I choose to stay connected to this divinity in all of my thoughts and in all of my actions. Then, what do you do when you hear about people blown up by terrorists or any other actions that are decidedly non-peaceful? Here's what I remind myself to think and say. I want to feel good. I didn't sign up for war or warlike thoughts. I'm an instrument of peace, and I send peaceful, loving thoughts to those people and places in the world who seem to need it so desperately. I refuse to collaborate with the energy of hatred anywhere, anytime. The alternative to this kind of peaceful thinking is anger, hatred, and fear, which aligns perfectly with the energy that is so distasteful. And your immediate reaction is then to seek revenge. A counterforce is established, and you're aligned with the same energy of hate that caused you to feel less than peaceful. What if, in response to suicide bombers, we tended the injured and grieved the dead, but didn't publicize the tragedy with news reports? What if no one reported the consequences of this kind of violence? No news reports, no film. What if we chose to respect the pain of the relatives and survivors by not commercializing pictures of their grief? What if this kind of thinking surfaced when these acts of hatred took place? The people who perpetrate these incidents are acting out of their own thoughts of hatred, hoping that others will respond in kind, and that hatred will continue unabated. But if it was no longer news, if no one gave them attention, their acts would necessarily have to come to a halt. You, personally, can be one of those people who stubbornly refuses to add low-energy thoughts to the hate you observe. By doing so, you can contribute to the demise of hatred. You can act singly to create more joy by steadfastly refusing to be hateful in any of your thoughts. You break the cycle of violence in the world not by hating violence, but by being your own instrument of peace. Choosing to experience peace by focusing on what you are for. You can experience peace by balancing all that transpires around you with God consciousness. There's nothing that requires you to react to evil doing with a non-spiritual mental response. You have a choice to put your mental energy into what you desire, and in so doing, create a new world. Let me tell you how I choose to respond to the bombardment of messages that focus on what's wrong in the world. First, I remind myself that for every act of evil, there are a million acts of kindness. I choose to believe that people are essentially good, and that by staying in this belief system, I help bring more of this consciousness to fruition. When enough of us take on this notion, we'll learn to live collectively in this peaceful awareness. Secondly, I know for certain that no amount of hatred in my heart will ever bring about peace. Hatred will only contribute more to the presence of those human-made destructive energies. So I choose to place my attention on what I am for, and on my feeling good. I support peace, not war. As Albert Einstein once remarked, I am not only a pacifist, but a militant pacifist. Nothing will end war unless the people themselves refuse to go to war. Unquote. I, as a recipient of the Einstein Award from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine of Yeshiva University, would humbly add, and unless people refuse to ever think warlike thoughts. In Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela wrote, "To make peace with an enemy, one must work with that enemy, and that enemy becomes one's partner." I know that we are all partners with each other. This is how I think. And when I see footage of a world that's in disarray, because many have forgotten this, I still choose to know that we'll ultimately learn to live this way collectively. But it begins with each of us refusing to be instruments of non-peace in all of our thoughts and consequently all of our behaviors. Adolf Hitler's designated successor, Hermann Göring, is quoted in Nuremberg Diary as saying, "Why, of course the people don't want war. But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country." That was Hermann Göring. I choose not to be one of those people who are dragged along. I refuse to be brought to the bidding of any leader who attempts to convince me that my beliefs in peace make me unpatriotic. When an unidentified Pentagon official was asked why the U.S. military censored graphic footage from the Gulf War, he responded, "If we let people see that kind of thing, there would never again be any war." Well, that's my goal. To live in a world where warlike thoughts are impossible because we're placing all of our mental energy on what we are for rather than on what we hate. Former President Dwight Eisenhower, who was also a commander of the Allies in World War II, once remarked, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense." This is a call to get ourselves and our world in balance. Peace demands heroic thinking and a purity of conscience. Third, when I see and hear evil, I remind myself, I didn't sign up to come here to be a part of hatred. While others obviously have, I'll remember to stay with the inner sense of peace that calls to me, and I'll surround those who behave in evil ways with the same light energy. I simply refuse to go to war in my thoughts. I choose to be a beacon of light for the places of darkness that are bereft of this kind of illuminating energy. Finally, as the dispatches of violence continue to come my way, I remind myself over and over again that we have a choice in how we respond to all of this. I know that by feeling hateful in response to hate, I only contribute to the presence of hatred in the world. As an ancient Chinese proverb tells us, quote, "If you decide to pursue revenge, you'd better dig 2 graves, unquote. I know that I have a choice to see what's good about the world rather than what has gone wrong. When those communiques of violence and hatred come streaming toward me, I push the mute button or even the off button, and I recall what the Dalai Lama once said. Quote, "Compassion and love are not mere luxuries. As the source of both inner and outer peace, they are fundamental to the continued survival of our species." Unquote. Those are extremely valuable words describing our need to be in balance. I stay balanced on this dimension of being in a peaceful world by saying them over and over and over again. I now know for certain that I'm obliged to stay in a consciousness of compassion and love, not only to maintain my own balance, but to help ensure the continued survival of our species. There can be no greater calling.